You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford, Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is... Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Dr. John Bishop back on the show with me today. He was on the show back, I guess it was back in the spring, with this, the way 2020 has been with COVID and all the shutdowns and stuff. It feels like it was 5 years ago, Dr. John, but I know it's just been a few months.
I think it was only June. It was June.
Yeah, it's so crazy.
It's crazy. I mean, we're in a time warp. Hopefully it'll go away soon, right?
We are in a time warp, and it has been the most bizarre, of years. First, before we get into all that, I've been asking some different authors what this shutdown and what the quarantine has meant for them, because, a lot of writers, we tend to spend a lot of time alone in a room, just writing stories, making up, events and characters in our head. But when someone tells you that you have to, kind of distance yourself from everyone, that kind of has, different side effects than you might think. What's this summer been like for you, and how is COVID affecting the world where you are?
Well, for a while we were strictly quarantined, and restaurants and grocery stores, and you had to pick up your food, and it was just a surreal sort of atmosphere. And at first, I was just happy to write and do my little thing. And then the weirdest thing happened. I sort of got blocked because I couldn't think about anything but the COVID virus. And I couldn't think about anything but wearing a mask and wearing your gloves and where's your hand sanitizer. And it totally disrupted our lifestyle.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure other people felt that way. I have a lot of my friends read, and they said, I can't read. I said, why can't you read? I said, I can't read because I'm too worried about the COVID virus, which is what you should be doing, is reading so you don't think about it.
Right. Well, it's kind of, what I was alluding to, there's kind of the unintended consequences of, most people read, multiple times a week just out of, their natural, this is part of their life. And, sure. But then telling someone you should be doing this to pass time, there's a mental block there. It's this is one of the things that no one's talking about COVID. And, that I think will be probably a project for sociologists for decades to come.
I think you're totally right. And you're right. No one has mentioned it or talked about it except maybe in private with your friends. But the media has never really addressed those psychological effects that this has on people. And right. We hope it goes away. It doesn't come back.
Absolutely. I think we all have our fingers crossed at this point. But we didn't come here to talk about COVID today. You have a new book that's just recently released called Act of Revenge, and it's the third in the Doc Brady mystery series. We talked earlier this year about Doc Brady and this fascinating story that you had about the writing of these characters and that first book, and how it finally came to be in the public. Recap that, if you would, for the listeners who haven't listened to that previous episode. And what was it? How did you get to this point?
Well, I was writing back in the 90s, and I wrote a series of novels beginning with Act of Murder about an orthopedic surgeon in Houston, and his name is Dr. Brady. And he got himself involved in different sort of things. On the first one, his next door neighbor's child was run over and killed, and he gets involved in an investigation with that. And the next one came out was Act of Deception, which I picked on the plaintiff's lawyers a little bit on that one. And then this third one was Act of Revenge, in which I got involved in the breast implant issue through some plastic surgeons, and and that sort of thing. And these novels just came. They were written in the 90s. These first few novels were written back then, many years ago. And Houston, the setting was Houston and Galveston, all back in the 90s with the restaurants and the sports teams. And through a series of circumstances, they did not get published in the 90s. They're getting published in the 2000s now. Which is a very odd thing, I'm sure, for most people.
So, do I remember right that one of your children helped to resurrect this novel?
Yes, yes. I had these novels written. And they were on these old ancient floppy disks, and I carried those disks around with me for 20 years. And for some reason, at Father's Day last year, my son said, "Hey, whatever happened to those floppy disks?" I said, "Oh man, I don't know. They're somewhere. I should have thrown them away." He said, "No, I think I can resurrect them into current computer language." And so I said, "Sure." So I gave him this little box, and Father's Day came along, and he gave this gift, and I opened it up, and there was Act of Murder that he had published on Amazon, and it was just like, holy smoke! I mean, I was obviously astounded and speechless, which is rare for me. And that's how the whole thing began. His industriousness, wanting he's just that kind of kid. He's not a kid. He's 45 years old, but still.
He's a kid to you, isn't he?
He'll always be a kid. Exactly. But that's how the whole thing began.
That's such a crazy story. Looking back on that book when it was published on Amazon, and then of course remembering writing the book, because this was a big part of your life. As this hobby that you had of writing that you hope to have published. Looking at it published in book form, available to everyone in the world, what were your, when you got over the shock and the obvious appreciation for your kid for doing this for you, when you had a chance to really have a look at it and to objectively kind of judge, that this was something that you wrote 20 years ago, or how did you feel about it? And how did you get kind of nostalgic about the characters again? And what was that feeling of coming back into this sort of forgotten world of yours?
Well, it was sort of a dream. Like, I think when I opened up and looked at the pages and started reading it, I was first of all, I was hypercritical. I said, "Oh, this is terrible. This is terrible writing. I mean, this sentence doesn't make sense." And Jim says, "Dad, read the book. Just read the book and get a feel for it. You can always get an editor to make it sound better."
Sure. So
anyway, I read the book through the first time, and when I finished, I thought, you know what? That wasn't half bad. I mean, it was certainly not Michael Conley or Lee Child, but it was not half bad. And I loved it because I'm looking at Houston 20 years later, when these restaurants are gone and the sports teams have changed names. It was like it's like I'd stepped onto a different planet, really, just going back in time. But it was very refreshing because it was a different era, the 90s. So anyway, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's it. I was hyper when I went back and read it again the second time and read it slower, and I thought it had some substance there, and there were some good things about it, and so maybe I wasn't crazy after all. So I thought, well, we'll see what happens.
Well, I love asking people about the beginnings of things. When you first met, and I'm doing air quotes here, met Dr. Jim Bob Brady, our protagonist in this series of books. How did he first come to you? And was it him that came to you first, or was it a scenario? How did this kind of world begin for you?
You know what? It's hard to say, because I had this burning desire to write something. I've been reading novels my whole life, fiction, mysteries, murder mysteries, medical fiction, that sort of thing. And I don't know, I just had this burning thing in my gut that I wanted to write something. And so I said, what do I know about? Well, you don't know much of anything except you know about doctrine because you are a doctor. So you should write about a doctor. Well, so maybe I'll invent a character that has some experiences like my own experience in orthopedic surgery. And so that was kind of born out of me wanting to write something that I knew something about, which is medicine. And it was easy to research medicine because I have all of these different sources that I had access to. And once I had the character, then I said, well, the character needs a wife. So I invented this Mary Louise, who is far better than any other woman on the planet I've ever met, an amalgam of all the great women I've ever known. And then I said, well, I got to have a child. So then we invented JJ, the son, who is, let me, I'm going to make up the fact that he's got a detective agency or so I could find somebody to help me do research. And this is how it all started. And then it just kind of morphed from there. Just kind of made it up.
That's so awesome. So, so the first book, gets published, and then you take another look at it and you start thinking. So what about the second and the third book? Because are these still books that you had written back then, or have you,
Yes.
Taken? Okay, so tell me about the process of updating these manuscripts, and were there anything that you changed from what you had originally envisioned?
Well, not really. The next two were also written back then, but I didn't want to leave them in the 90s, but I ended up leaving in the 90s. What happened, I ended up with a wonderful public relations agent named Fazia Burke. And she took me on as a client and sort of gave me direction about what to do next because I had no clue. And she said she thought it would be wonderful to try to keep the book in the period of the 90s, not necessarily the early 90s, but get all three books set in the 90s and bring them up to date a little bit if you need to. But back at the 2001 and 1991 are virtually the same. So the decision was made to keep them in the 90s, and I had to update some things, but not as much as I was going to be writing about something happening in today. That would be a huge difference. So these are all written in the 90s, and they're all about the same characters and the same restaurants and the same organizations that they were back then.
That's so. Tell me about the story of book 3 of Active Revenge, and we meet a new character with Lou Edwards. We kind of set the story up and tell me how it begins and what we see dear Jim Bob get himself into.
Well, Jim Bob is on a ski trip with his wife Mary Louise in Aspen. Back then you could go to medical meetings and you'd have skiing during the day and lectures in the late afternoon. And so he's on the slopes and he literally runs into another human being on the slopes. And he fractures this guy's leg and tears up his knee. And this guy is Lou Edwards. And it turns out Lou Edwards is a plastic surgeon in Houston, who Jim Bob does not know. But Jim gets him taken care of, gets his knee fixed, does all this kind of stuff. The families become very friendly. And it turns out that Lou Edwards has had his medical malpractice insurance canceled because of breast implant issues. I don't know how much the reader remembers about the breast implant issues in the 90s, but that was a huge thing where the plaintiffs' lawyers lined up to sue doctors and Dow Chemical and Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing.
Oh, yeah. It was a big deal.
It was a big deal, and it was a huge deal in Houston because the guys that invented the implants lived in Houston and were plastic surgeons from Houston. So the storyline goes now that the insurance, the malpractice insurance of the plastic surgeon has been canceled, and Lou Edwards, he's interviewed on camera, and he says something to the effect, we're going to bring you down to the corporate CEO of the company. And the next day, the guy's found shot in the head and dead. So talk about open mouth, insert foot.
Right.
So the story then goes on about what happened and who killed the guy and who's involved and who's not involved, and it gets kind of weird and kind of creepy, and then the ending comes and it's kind of a shocker. I'm still surprised when I read the ending, and I wrote it.
Papyrus Author was designed and developed with the modern writer's needs, wishes, and preferences in mind. From big structures right down to tiny details, every single feature of our software has been carefully and meticulously crafted in collaboration with authors. Take charge of your writing with the author interface, which gives you access to different elements of your story, such as characters, backgrounds, and narrative structure. Move sections of your writing seamlessly in the navigator and evaluate the complexity of your text with our expert style and readability analysis. Never worry about losing progress with automated backups. With Papyrus Author, you can be your own writer, editor, and publisher. The world of writing is about to change. Papyrus Author, the word processor for authors, has arrived on the international stage. Unrivaled in its scope, it is the first software suite to unite every single step of creative writing. The vision behind Papyrus Author is to empower everyone with an idea to turn it into a great book for free. A word processing core that matured for over 10 years at its foundation, Papyrus Author goes beyond the text with its intuitive organizing layers for story, characters, notes, and research. The powerful style and readability analysis help raise manuscript quality. The inbuilt publication capabilities take the book directly to the reader with ebooks, DocX, and print-ready PDF. Visit papyrusauthor.com to get started today. That's the best kind, isn't it? Where you feel like that you kind of had an out of body experience in writing something. Like, did this story come from me? Where did this come from?
I mean, aliens, man. It's
it's always the aliens.
This writing thing, it's as you just said, it just comes from, you have no idea where it comes from. It just comes from inside somewhere, and how it got there and how it got out, you have no idea.
Right. Well, Dr. John, having these stories kind of come back into your life, being resurrected from, the old manuscripts that you wrote, has this fired you up to do some new, fresh writing?
Yes, I have been doing fresh writing. We're having to kind of update things and update the scenery and bring it. What I've done is I've written a few more. And every novel, I make it 2 or 3 or 4 years later in time. So I'm creeping back up to the present time. And that's not easy, but it's been fun because I can kind of write about a cell phone now. Whereas before, everything was like looking for a quarter for a payphone back in the 90s.
That's one of the things that do you remember? It's been a decade or more ago now when the Jason Bourne movies came out, and of course, based on the fantastic Robert Ludlum books. It had been quite a while since I'd had a look, and it was just a brief look at the time at the Bourne novels. So I picked up. I enjoyed the movie, so I picked up the novels. And one thing that I was immediately kind of hit in the face with a frying pan was the fact that the opening scene. I'm still trying to remember it. You encounter Jason Bourne, and he's running through a cityscape, and he finds a payphone to go in, and he kind of hacks this payphone. And it's kind of culture shock, because these books took place or were written in the 70s and took place around there. So the technology is all completely different. Have you had a kind of a culture shock moment like that in revisiting these books and re-editing them? And is it difficult to go back to that 90s mindset?
Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, it was a long time ago, and I had a scene. I had a scene in the first novel when Jim Bob accompanies the ambulance with the child who's been injured in active murder, whose child is dead actually, and he gets to the hospital and he's trying to get a hold of his wife, and he has to ask somebody, can he borrow change for the payphone, because in 1991 you weren't flipping on your cell phone,
right?
And so that kind of started it, and then there's all sorts of other little things that you just take for granted, like there was no internet, there was no searching the internet for details or this and that. And so I didn't realize how far we'd been since the 90s until I wrote that book and lived in the 90s again for a while. So it's amazing.
So mysteries, especially like murder mysteries, there's a lot of things that you can do with the internet, a lot of information that you can gather, pretty quickly, and lots of things are readily available. And you go back to the 90s, and like you alluded to, there's a lot of that stuff's just not there. What if you were to write a new novel today, would it be set in present time, or do you like having some of those barriers to technology and things like that the 90s provide you as a writer? How would you address a story today?
Well, I've been as I've approached these novels and have written more current information, I find that I can get on the phone or get on the computer and look up almost anything. Whereas in the old days, the only real assets I had were to go to a library. And in my case, I would use the Houston Academy of Medicine, which is the Harris County Medical Society Library in Houston. And people would Xerox copies, get that Xerox, it would make copies for me and put them in a satchel, and I would pick it up. And that would be the research that I would do for these books and for medical diseases. And now all that stuff is just at the tip of your fingers. So when I've been writing lately, currently I'm writing more recent time so that all those things are available to everybody, as opposed to keeping it back in the old days.
Right. John, I've gotten the pleasure of getting to know lots and lots of writers, and mystery and thriller writers especially are some of the nicest people that you would ever meet. Yet they tend to write stories that look at the darker side of our human nature. Why do you think nice humble people love stories about twisted, deranged people? What is it about us that loves these kinds of stories?
You know what? I'd say Dean Koontz has got to be one of the best at that. He's the nicest guy in the world, but boy, he can write some weird stuff.
I know. I got to interview him last month or so, and one of the most genuine, nicest people you ever met. But yeah, so some twisted stuff comes out of that mind of his.
Well, I think it's better that if that stuff has to come out, it's better that it comes out in print than in real life.
What do you think about the readers? Why do we love stories like this? Is it because that we get to experience some of the darker side of the world without leaving the comfort of our reading chair or whatever? I mean, is it something about human nature that wants to confront fear without being put into harm's way?
The harm's way, absolutely. There's a classic. I don't know if it's a book or a TV show. It's called Ozark, with Jason Bateman, who they say is one of the nicest guys in the world. But let me tell you what, I'd love to sit and watch that thing, but I would be scared to death to be a guy who's trying to launder money for a drug cartel in a town in Arkansas. But that's what this character is doing, and I think we like to look at danger from afar.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that you were writing some more. Are there more adventures with Dr. Jim Bob coming up?
Yes, there are more.
Yeah. What does he get into next?
Well, he gets into next. The next is called the act of negligence, and he gets a bunch of weird referrals for patients in the hospital. Patients all have a dementia, and they have various and sundry medical problems and orthopedic problems. And he gets on the trail of perhaps a nursing home director that is not doing good things for his patients. And so that's about nursing home malfeasance.
That's going to be fascinating. I can't wait to see what you do with that. What is your upcoming publishing schedule looking like? How often do you see another book coming out?
Well, I'm having a conference call with the people tomorrow about that very thing. But these first 3 books were released about every 3 months, just to sort of, I'm a new guy. Nobody knows who I am. And I'm, and so the decision was to put 3 out during this 6-month or 9-month time span. But I think that they're suggesting 6 months. Have one every 6 months.
That's amazing. John, how do you feel as a writer now, having had this dream back then let it go dormant for a while, and then to have this rekindled? Do you feel like that you're in a better place creatively now than you were then? It's hard. It's hard to think about. When you're in the midst of writing, all you can think about is publishing that. But sometimes it's better to let things sit for a little while. Maybe the market will be better. Maybe we're more prepared personally. Who knows? But do you feel like you're in a better place now to tackle the series?
Well, I think back when I was in the 90s, I was working, 40, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, depending on the schedule. And so I had time to write on the weekends, and that's when I did it. And I as a novice writer, I mean, I was kind of a hack, I guess, about it, but I had some good story ideas. And so as I've gotten older and I've retired now, I mean, I have much more time to be creative, and I feel like I'm better putting ideas together than I was back then. I just don't have the same experiences because I'm not in that milieu of the hospital every day like I used to be. But I was in that business for so long that I think I can remember what it's like to be in there for another few years.
That's awesome. Well, I can't wait to see what's coming up next. Dr. John Bishop, the new book is Act of Revenge, a medical thriller. It's book 3 in the Doc Brady mystery series. We're going to put links to it in the show notes to make it easy for everyone to find it. Where can people find you online, Dr. John, if they want to dig into all the great stuff you're doing?
It's called, the website is called johnbishopauthor.com.
Awesome. We'll put links there as well so that people can find it. And we wish you much success, John, and we're going to promote Act of Revenge everywhere.
Hey, you've been great talking to you. I appreciate what you're doing. Really do.
Do you ever wonder if a person's critical thinking comes at the expense of their own happiness? Is it possible to be very happy and still practice excellent discernment? I used to wonder the same thing. Then I discovered the Trouble in Paradise podcast with Nigel Kent and Jasmine Starr, where they laugh as well as think about conspiracy theories and unexplained phenomena without ever getting bogged down in the age-old tug-of-war between logic and feeling. The Trouble in Paradise podcast is a joyful program for critical thinkers who have a sense of humor. Join Nigel and Jasmine as they probe the intriguing and wacky culture of odd occurrences, strange news, and ridiculous coincidences on this hilariously intelligent podcast. Trouble in Paradise on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Stitcher. Follow @Tipcast239 on Twitter. Trouble in Paradise with Nigel Ken and Jasmine Starr, a happy podcast for critical thinkers like you.